There are men who violently attack this pulpit and come up here and immediately start yelling and getting loud, but he ain't here tonight. So we're not going to do that. We're going to ease into it a little bit. And that's the only time I'll pick on him, I promise. Tonight's sermon, before we begin, I definitely want to thank the elders for the opportunity to speak. I thoroughly enjoy it. Thank Rusty for the kind comments this morning. And it is a treat, because no one enjoys hearing me speak as much as I do. So it most certainly is a treat. But tonight, there's a challenge in filling in my opinion. There's always a challenge in filling in. You get one shot, and you have all these ideas. What do I want to speak on? What do I want to do? And I really enjoy speaking on Sunday evenings. I mean, we all know who we're preaching to on Sunday evenings. But you have all these good ideas, and if I have them, they're good ideas. You can ask Miranda if you need verification on that. If I have it, it's a good idea. But you have all these great ideas. What do I want to do? What do I want to speak on? What do I want to talk about? And I got to share something with you, that I was going to work a couple of weeks ago, and Jerry Reed's voice popped in my head and said, "Why are we doing this?" And I am not as ashamed as I should be to admit to you that I can quote more of Smokey and the Bandit than the New Testament. But Jerry Reed's voice said, "Why are we doing this?" That's a line in Smokey and the Bandit. That's a pivotal question in all our lives. It's a pivotal question in my life. Why are we doing this? There are moments, speaking for myself, I don't know if everybody has this or not. We all have fond memories of things when we were growing up and things when we were younger. But there are moments of absolute clarity for me. I can remember it like I was there. And that's what was going on, as I was asking myself, why are we doing this? I can remember being 17 years old and being face down in grass in a football uniform going, why am I doing this? And that was at practice, not in the game. And the only answer I could come up with was, because I love it. And I did. I can remember being 24 and standing in a decorated auditorium and going, why am I doing this? And the answer was, because I love her. And funny enough, I think she was asking the same question, because when she was queued up, it took about 5 minutes for the doors to open. And my best man, handsome fella, was behind me and going, I think she split. But thankfully she didn't. But why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why do we get up on what was quite possibly the most gorgeous day we've had in the past 6 months? Why do we get ourselves ready? Why did we come here? Why are we doing this? The basic answer that I can come up with is the answer that I had to that question, the other two examples I gave, because we love it. Because we love him, because of love. A 4-letter word that is thrown around so often in so many different facets. You can think, I mean, in the Greek there are 7 words for love. In English we have 1. Now we're not going to do a lesson on the Greek forms of the word and what they mean, but we have so many different definitions of love. But when we think of love in New Testament terms, where do we automatically go? It's October, it's football and wedding season, so where do we automatically go when we think of New Testament love? 1 Corinthians 13, which will be our text tonight, by the way, if you want to be turning there. But 1 Corinthians 13, if you've attended a wedding lately, anybody, maybe, if you've attended a wedding lately, you've more than likely heard 1 Corinthians 13. And I'm not going to say it's out of text, because it's not. But it's always funny to me when you go to a wedding and you either hear 1 Corinthians 13 or Ruth. And I stayed away from Ruth when Miranda and I got married, because that was a woman talking about her mother-in-law. And I love my mother-in-law, but whether she go, I don't necessarily go. Promise you. But when we think of 1 Corinthians 13, we think of love, but we think of romantic love. We think of a man falling in love with a woman and being united, because that's how it's always quoted. And those middle Those middle 4 verses are beautiful in describing love, and we'll get there. But it's not necessarily describing romantic love. When we think of 1 Corinthians 13, the other thing we should be thinking of is how we should look at each other in this building, in this room right now. How we should look on each other with love. And how we should look on everybody not in this building or in this room right now with love. And it is nice to think about the romantic love, but we need to think about the other side of that as well. So tonight, our lesson, we're going to have 3 E's. He's not here, but he's here in spirit. 3 E's. We're going to talk about the essentialness of love, the explanation of love, and the endurance of love. Will be our lesson tonight. And as I said, I've entitled it, Why Are We Doing This? But the answer is love. We'll start in 1 Corinthians 13 with our text. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read the first 3 verses. As I said, I've broken the chapter up into three parts. Starting in verse 1, and I am reading and teaching from the New King James tonight. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Love, if you don't have it, you completely miss the point. Bottom line, that's the general gist of what we're going to do now. If you can't say that you are here out of love, if you can't say that you do anything out of love, you miss the point entirely. Romans 13:10 says, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Jesus said point blank, if you love me, how will you show it? You'll keep my commandments. If you can't do it with love, and I'm not saying there can't be a sense of obligation, but if the obligation is not out of love, you have missed the point. You have dropped the proverbial ball. But to tell people to love is not enough. It's not enough to tell somebody you got to do it out of love. You have to do things with love. You have to have love in your heart to do it. That's not enough. You have to explain things to everybody. You have to teach things to everybody. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how long you've been doing what you're doing. Sometimes you have to have things explained to you. And you have to be willing to take that explanation. That's where I have to work because I already know everything. But every now and then I do have to have things explained to me. It's like when the best example I can give is we have trainees. When I was on the golf course, you have guys that come in, and everybody says, Roy Williams has one of the greatest quotes on golf course labor I've ever heard. Every grown man thinks he can do 2 jobs. He can be a golf course superintendent and he can be a college head coach. So everybody comes in when you work on a golf course and they say, it's mowing, I've been mowing my yard for 30 years, I can mow. Sure, you can mow, but can you mow like this? And that's the way we're going to look at it tonight. You can love, you have loved, you do love, but can you love like this? 1 Corinthians 13. In verse 1, he says, if I could speak with tongues, and again I'm paraphrasing, forgive me. If I can speak with tongues, and if I can speak the language of the angels, and we can assume very clearly from that text that the language of the angels is a very complex language that we wouldn't understand. But if I could speak with tongues, and I can speak with the language of the angels, and I don't have love, I've become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. I look at this, and a lot of people say, well, brass instruments are beautiful. I've got a brother that is a great trumpet player, He was not always a great trumpet player, but when I hear sounding brass, I think of more of the clanging cymbal part. Have you ever heard a cymbal by itself? Have you ever heard, do we have any drummers in here? Do you ever just beat on the cymbal by itself? It's awful. It's awful. It's the musical equivalent of getting a tin trash can and beating on it with a stick. It's just a noise. It's just a noise. And he jumps right in. Paul jumps right in verse 1 of chapter 13 and says, if I can do these things, if I can speak in tongues, if I can miraculously speak the language of the angels, and I don't do it with love, I might as well be, forgive the paraphrase again, beating on a trash can with a stick. Because it means nothing. It means nothing without the love. I mean, you had the miraculous gifts, and again, when we get into verse 2 a little bit more, we talk about more of the miraculous gifts. And we get to the end of the chapter, we'll go back to the miraculous gifts. But if you had them, and you couldn't use them with love, didn't matter. Didn't matter. Verse 3, well, let's go to verse 2. We just talked about it. If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. Again, if you have these miraculous gifts, if you had miraculous knowledge, and we've talked, Brock's had several lessons, and several people have stood in this auditorium and given lessons on miraculous gifts. We understand that. But if you had miraculous gifts without love, you had nothing. But verse 3 is where we come into play. Verse 3 is where we, modern-day Christians, have to pay attention. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but I have not love, it profits me nothing. Now, has anybody in here at any point ever considered giving away everything they had to feed the poor? No. If you say yes, you're lying. I'm sorry, but I feel that you're lying. I feel quite the opposite. Again, not as ashamed of that as I probably should be, but sometimes I think I wish somebody would give everything away to help feed me. Not that I've missed many meals. But today we don't have the problems that the first century church had. We don't have to band together to eat. I appreciate James's prayer when he said that we can worship freely and we don't have to fear when we come to worship. We don't have the problems that the first century church had. Nobody's got to worry about giving everything they have to make sure somebody's getting fed. We're going to feed them. We're going to feed them. One way or another, you're going to get fed. Nobody's got to sell their truck. Nobody's got to sell their house and everything. But even if you did, and you do it without love, meaningless. We have a pretty good example of that. Most of us are familiar with what happened in Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5 is the example of that. You can give as much as you want to give. If you're not giving for the right reason, you're not going to suffer the same fate that Ananias and Sapphira suffered, but it means about that much. We all know what happened to Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. But verse 3, most applicable to us. That's a big word. I have problems with those. Again, giving our things away, not as much a thing today as it would have been back then, but even the offering that we give. If we're not giving out of love, if we're not giving cheerfully, you're wasting your time. Now, I'm not saying that money's wasted, because the men who see to that money, the men who see to those funds make very good use out of it. But you yourself are wasting your time. It's food for thought. Give your body to be burned and have not love. Can you, don't answer, this is rhetorical before I say it. Has anybody ever considered giving themselves up? Could you give yourself could you sacrifice yourself for another person? I hope the answer is yes. I hope if you are here that the answer is yes. I could give my body up. I could give myself away for this person, for more than one person. But how many people could say that? How many people would say that? It befuddles me with the intention of, I'd give myself up because, man, I'd be famous. And I hate to say this, but you see this on the news all the time. This guy pulled so-and-so from a burning car. This guy attacked the bank robber before the bank robber could strike. Why did they do it? Did they do it out of concern, or did they do it because, man, Cameron Kent might interview me? I mean, you see where I'm going there? If you don't give yourself up, if you don't put yourself in harm's way because you love, meaningless. So the essentialness of love, what we need to gather from that, it's kind of like it said in Galatians 5. Galatians 5 and verse 6. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh with love. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what your background is. The only thing that matters is your faith working with love. Your giving, your sacrifice, your being here with love. The essentialness of love. Must have it. Moving in the explanation. We have the essentialness. We move into the explanation of love. And in verses 4 through 7, we get the best definition of love in the New Testament. My opinion. My opinion. And again, it's wedding season. If you haven't heard this yet, you will at some point. But beginning in verse 4. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. Is not puffed up. Love suffers long, and it's kind of, I think suffers long kind of speaks for itself. If you love someone, you'll be patient with them. Love induces patience. But do we really understand that? Are we really patient? We got a couple of farmers in here. I know we've got a lot of gardeners in here. You don't go out and poke a hole in the ground and drop a watermelon seed in there and get mad 3 days later because you don't have a vine. Love suffers all things. Love pushes us to patience. It never fails. Right now at work, we're overseeding. We're aerating and overseeding. We're seeding people's lawns for them, and it never fails. We'll seed a lawn, and 5 days later, we'll get a call in, we'll get a complaint, and somebody says, "You seeded my lawn 5 days ago, and I see nothing." "Yes, ma'am. By the way, are you from Connecticut?" "I sure am. How'd you know that?" Wild guess. Wild guess. But love suffers all things. Love pushes us to patience. Love is kind. Kindness is not simply an action. Kindness is backed by our words and our action. You can do nice things to people and totally negate it by what comes out of your mouth, correct? Yes. Kindness is our words backed up by our actions. It's kind of like I always think of in Luke chapter 6. We're all familiar with Luke chapter 6. It's probably Jesus' most famous sermon in Luke chapter 6. And he says, it's like lending. If I let you borrow something and I know you're going to give it back, what does that matter? What does that say about me? If I give you the keys to my truck and I know you're going to bring it back, you're probably going to top the tank off and you might even wash it. Big deal. I didn't do anything great. But if you lend to somebody and you know full well they're not going to pay me back, but they need it, that's kindness. That's loving kindness. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 13, kindness in verse 4. Doesn't parade itself, doesn't envy. Envy is far and away has to be the antagonist to love. Envy is the other driving force, whether we can admit that or not. We can call it covetousness, we can call it whatever we want, but envy is the antagonist to love. I'm going to do this because did you see how nice it looked when he did it? That statement could be taken either way. And I say that, and when I say that, I think of so-and-so did this in their yard, somebody added this fire pit, because, you know, that's our business right now is what people do with their yards. But sometimes when we say, I'm going to do this because you see how it looked when so-and-so did it. I'm going to get into singing, and I am ashamed to admit this, but I can openly admit it at this point. I went 32 years of my life and did not lead the singing, would not lead the singing, no way, no how. Because in my mind, I didn't sound as good as my dad. So it didn't matter. It didn't matter. That's not a motivation. That's the wrong reason not to, and that would have been the wrong reason to do. It took me 32 years of growing up, and if you ask the right person, not there yet, but growing up to realize you're not singing to sound like somebody else. You're singing, and we had a lesson on it this morning, a great lesson on it this morning. You're singing to God. That's what matters. It doesn't matter what you sound like. You're singing to God. But envious. I think that might be the first time in my life that I've ever openly admitted being envious of my dad. So you might want to write that one down. But envy is the antagonist to love. Not puffed up. Not puffed up. We know what puffed up means. Again, this is a self-explanatory chapter of the Bible. But every now and then we need to be reminded, love isn't proud. Love doesn't do things to be seen. Proverbs 15:33 says point blank, the fear of the Lord is instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Have a little humility. If you need a lesson on humility, come to me because I'm great at it. I might have that backwards. But humility comes before honor. You're not puffed up. You don't do things to be seen. You don't do things because, well, I'm good at it, so I'm going to do it. No. You do things out of love. You're not puffed up about it. Going into the next verse, doesn't behave unseemly. The New King James Version says, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, not provoke, thinks no evil. Behaving unseemly. Behaving unseemly is something that I think everyone struggles with at some point. And when we say doesn't behave rudely, I don't think rude is the word. It took me a long time growing up to realize that everything I did was a ministry, in a sense. Everything I did spoke to how I felt about what I did in the worship service. If I left the worship service and I went down to the river and did a bunch of things that I probably shouldn't have been doing, well, what did that say about what I just did? Love doesn't behave rudely. Love doesn't behave unseemly. Our actions will reflect our love. Doesn't seek its own. Matthew 16, what does Matthew 16 say? Again, it's not exactly a paraphrase, but a snippet of the chapter. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, if any man come after me, what does he need to do? Deny himself. Deny himself. If you're going to come after Christ, you need to be able to say, doesn't matter what I want. Matters what he wants. Love doesn't seek its own. Isn't quick to be angry. Isn't quick to be angry. Again, I always pick things to speak on that I need to hear. Because Frankie and I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago. It's a different kind of studying when you have to study it in order to teach it. And I always pick things that I need to hear. Love isn't quick to be angry. Again, that's in verse 5. Is not provoked, is what it says. Isn't quick to be angry. My favorite comic book character is the Hulk. And I am married to a woman, and I have several good friends that say because you identify with him. But the thing is, the Hulk just gets mad and explodes. We all know, whether you're a Lou Ferrigno fan or a modern-day Avengers fan, you know what the story of the Hulk. We can't be that way. We've got to have enough love not to get angry. I've watched men that I've looked up to for several years, most of my life, and I would say, how can he just sit there? How can he sit there? Somebody would say something, and I'd say, just don't sit there. Get up. And I was a younger man. Get up and put one across his lips, as Fred Sanford would say, put 5 across his lips. It's a loving man or a loving woman, whatever the case may have been, not quick to anger, out of love. Proverbs 16:32. I love going to the Proverbs for lessons. Proverbs 16:32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Slow to anger is better than being mighty in Proverbs. Thinks no evil. Again, back in verse 5. Love thinks no evil. Can anybody in this room escape evil thoughts? Anybody, if you can, raise your hand, because I would love to hear your methods. No one can escape an evil thought. Nobody. We live in a rude era. It's just rude. Most kids don't know the meaning of the word cotillion anymore. I remember when once upon a time, if you weren't taking cotillion, you weren't in that crowd. Kids don't know the meaning of the word cotillion. Kids don't know etiquette. So if you can spend any time, no offense guys, around a teenager and not have an evil thought, we need to talk. We need to talk. But there's an old Chinese proverb that says, you can't keep a bird from flying over your head. You can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from making a nest in your hair. You can't keep from having evil thoughts, but you can push them away. You can put them behind you. We need to be like children. It's the beautiful thing about a child. A child can get so mad, can get just so angry, and I love it about kids because you see them and they're just red in the face mad, and 30 seconds later, they don't even remember being mad. We need to take on that. Jesus said himself. We need to become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. Love doesn't rejoice in iniquity. That should be on its own, stand alone enough. Does not rejoice in iniquity. If you rejoice in the iniquity of someone else, you obviously don't have love. Love bears all, believes all, endures all things, hopes all. I skipped hope. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love bears a lot. I can tell you I was a great kid. That's obvious. We've already covered that. But a parent's love bears a lot. I've learned that. Even not having kids yet, I think, wow, how did I survive? But love bears all things. Love believes all things. Now, is that saying anything that anybody tells you? It's the truth. Does that mean that anybody off the street can come up to you? Because when I was in Charlotte, it was amazing how many times a week that these same two guys in the same utility van would come up and say, man, I bought this TV and I just don't want it. I'll give it to you cheap. I believe that, right? Same two guys bought a lot of TVs. But I believe that, right? No. Love believes all. If a brother comes to you and says, this is what's going on, this is the situation right now, out of love, we give the benefit of the doubt. If somebody says, I'm going to do this, or on the other hand, somebody says, I don't do this, we give them the benefit of the doubt out of love. Love endures all things. Endures all things. This is my favorite, one of my favorite parts of the chapter. The Greek word there, the Greek word is hupomeno. Hupomeno. Hupomeno is a military term in that sense. In the Greek, hupomeno is a military term because everybody always says, well, it bears all things and endures all things. Isn't that the same thing? The sense of endure there, the Greek word hupomeno is a military term meaning to stand against great force. And you can see the difference. Love endures anything you can throw at it. Anything you can throw at it. That movie, most people have seen it, the 300 Spartans, the story of King Leonidas fighting against the Persians in Greece, ancient Greece. 300 men standing against thousands and thousands and thousands of men. That's that hupomeno. That's that Greek standing against any force that comes at it. That's the endures right there. Love endures anything you can throw at it. Which takes us into the third thing. We've talked about the essentialness of love. We've talked about, excuse me, I got something caught strictly in my throat. We talked about the endurance, or the essentialness of love. We've explained love, and our third E is the endurance of love. We get into the last part of the chapter. And again, everybody, when you go to these weddings and you hear this, they fly through this part. They fly through this part. Nobody wants to hit this. But the endurance of love, 8 through 13, we'll read that very quickly. Love never fails, but whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known. Brock would say that'll preach, won't it? And it sure will. But the endurance of love. Prophecy failing, we need to understand, whether there is prophecy, it will fail. Does that mean prophecy will not hold up? No. That means if it's in here, if it's prophesied, it'll hold up. That means it's not going to last forever. And again, we've had multiple lessons on that. We understand that. But prophecy will fail in the sense that we won't always have that benefit of miraculous prophecy to lean on. Tongues will cease. Tongues will cease. We have missionaries now. And I know if you're an international missionary, you have just got to sometimes just long for the gift of miraculous tongues. I wanted to ask Don last week while he was here, and I never got a chance to. Do you know Indian? I'm sure he does. That's probably a stupid question because England colonized India, so they all speak English. But I want to ask him, how many different tongues do you have to know to go in there and preach? Today, missionaries spend semesters learning these languages to go speak. Once upon a time, that wasn't the case. It was miraculous tongues. You miraculous went. That'll cease. That's what he's saying. And again, we've all heard that before. Verse 9, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. Here's where we get into the nitty-gritty of it. In part. In part. What does that mean? We know in part. We prophesy in part. We have to understand what that meant to them. Now we know it all. We know it all. And we'll sum these last 4 verses up, because when it says, for now, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I played as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. Verse 10, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away with. All these verses, everything following until verse 13, is speaking about the same thing. These people needed these gifts. These people needed this miraculous gift because they had parts. The gospel was not revealed all at one time. We are lucky in that sense. What does it mean when that which is perfect, when that which is perfect shall come, then that which is in part will be done away with? What does that mean? What does that mean? Do you have anything that qualifies as being perfect? You should be holding one right now. When that which is perfect has come, when the complete Word of God has come, no more need for miraculous gifts. No more need for miraculous gifts. All that simply means is, that doesn't mean that when Jesus came, that was it. When he comes back, because that's the interpretation that you hear. I had a guy argue that with me one time. It says when that which is perfect has come, that which is in part will cease. That means miracles are still here, gifts are still here, because Jesus hasn't come back yet. It doesn't say when he who is perfect shall come. It says when that which is perfect. We have the complete, perfect will of God at our access. It'll stop. Things didn't come all at one point. Wrap this up quickly, but I mean, even in Acts, if you look at Acts as the history of the New Testament, in verse 2, we had the plan of salvation. In chapter 2, we had the plan of salvation. In chapter 5, we had the need for church discipline. In 6, deacons. Chapter 10, thankfully for us, we had the Gentiles in the new law. Things didn't come all at once. They came in part for them. These things will pass away. And we get the final assurance. That's the beautiful part. We wrap it up in the endurance of love. In verse 13, and now abide faith, hope, and love, which are eternal. All 3 are eternal. Until, as we sing someday, when the faith shall be sight. Now abide faith, hope, and love, but of these 3, the greatest of these is love. Simple sermon. We've heard it 1,000 times. I want to do it again tonight because it never hurts to revisit it. Love. If you're not here out of love, if you can't do things with love in your heart, don't do them. Don't do them. And that sounds horrible for somebody to say, don't do it, to act nice. A tree is known by its fruit. We're known by our fruit. If we don't have love, it will show through. If we don't love as we were loved. If we are not loved as God loves us. God loved us enough to redeem us. Every time we gather, we have the opportunity. We extend the invitation now because every time we gather, God gives us the opportunity to be redeemed because we are loved. Perhaps it is that you've once loved, you've once felt loved, and you've fallen away. It happens. It happens. Perhaps you need to come forward and talk to someone. Perhaps it is that you've never put on Christ. How do we put on Christ? We had a good lesson on that again this morning about the baptism. Point blank. We must. In Acts chapter 2, verse 38, the question is asked and the question is answered. What must we do? Put on Christ in baptism, calling on the name of the Lord for the remission of sins. If you need that opportunity tonight, you have not done so, please come as together we stand and sing.